All right, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so units 5 and 6, these are my favorite units actually, personally. But unit 5 is about revolutions, political revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, and unit 6 is imperialism. So pretty big units. And kind of this is where a DBQ could come from. Last year, the DBQ was this time period, but it's probably not going to be this year. But nonetheless, there are a lot of questions, multiple choice questions especially, that might pop up in that time period. All right, so as usual, these are the big themes. I'm going to go one by one, talk about some of the big ideas. All right. So in terms of the environment, kind of some of the things about this time period that make it unique is going to be kind of how the environment impacts industrialism and the effect of industrialism on the environment. So a few things kind of about the environment and how it leads to industrialization. One of them is the availability of natural resources. England, where the Industrial Revolution begins, has coal, it has iron, it has timber. And all of these things are very essential in making the early factories in the Industrial Revolution. Kind of something that is oftentimes overlooked by students is also that England has a lot of natural riverways. And these natural riverways are essential not only in terms of power generation, a lot of the early factories depended on water wheels, for example, but also access to overseas trade routes. That's really is what's going to make the Industrial Revolution pop off, so to say. The fact that people can trade overseas and that places like England have a lot of access to that, thanks to canals, thanks to rivers. But another natural kind of thing that will help with the Industrial Revolution is the second agricultural revolution. The first agricultural revolution, in case you're curious, that was the invention of farming. But the second agricultural revolution, this is going to be agricultural improvements to farm technology, basically. So we have this vitalization in farming, in agricultural production. And the reason why this is happening is because of new technologies. The mechanical reaper, fertilizers, and this concept of crop rotation. All three of these things will allow for increased food output. So if you ever got a question about the second agricultural revolution, it could be a sort of continuity and change sort of thing. It could be kind of what is similar about an earlier period of food increase. But generally, kind of the result of the agricultural revolution is going to be the Industrial Revolution. We have more food that can be produced with less people. Technology is replacing the need for many farmers. So as a result, that is going to lead to more industrial workers. We have suddenly a lot of free people able to work in factories. There's enough food for factory production, basically. But as usual in this class, more food means bigger cities. And this is important because factories tend to always be in urban centers. So kind of on the Unit 5 test, there were some people that got tripped up on that. Factories are always going to be in urban centers. The effects of industrialization are pretty self-explanatory. On the one hand, you have devastation to the environment, pollution, smoke, greenhouse gases start to emerge during this time. It's mostly coal, though. Coal is the primary fuel source of the first and second industrial revolution. Oil is the 20th century, so the next time period. But of course, we also do see that the demand for raw materials is going to lead to imperialism. Imperialism, the economic motivation for it is natural resources. Things like palm oil, things like rubber, things like cotton. So we do kind of see that trade in natural resources is going to be a big thing in this unit, mostly to fuel the Industrial Revolution. So continuity in terms of the demand for raw materials, but change in that they're going to be used in industrial processes. Rubber is used for, well, a lot of things. Tires, for example. Diamonds, not necessarily used in industry, but as this middle class starts to emerge, they want to buy luxury goods like diamonds, for example. Cotton is used in textiles. Something to kind of memorize and put in your notes. First industrial revolution is textiles. Textiles need cotton. Second industrial revolution is steel, chemicals, and electricity. Those are the three things of the second industrial revolution. So cotton is needed for textiles. Where does cotton grow? Cotton grows in Egypt, cotton grows in India, two places the British will imperialize. Cotton also grows in the American South as well, just in case there are any questions about that. Palm oil is used in factories, but we need to feed all these workers. We need to get food from places like Argentina and Chile, beef. Anybody know what guano is by any chance? Yes, it is bird poop. And why is this something that's actually being harvested during this time? Well, it's because of the second agricultural revolution. Bird poop is rich in nitrogen. It's able to be used in fertilizer. So we actually do see that all of these things are going to assist in industrialization. These products will be used in factories, will be consumed. Well, you don't consume diamonds, obviously, but purchased by people. New infrastructure is also being built because of industrialization. Steamships allow for travel into the interior of Africa. We also have railroads as well. But also kind of something the AP wants you to know is that agricultural work is still going on at this time. Spices in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, are being farmed. So we do see that the demand for agricultural cash crop workers continues. But slavery is not a thing after 1750 in terms of your AP world content. Slavery really ends by the 1830s in Latin America. It ends in America in the 1860s. But for the most part, kind of the new labor force in this age of imperialism are indentured servants, people who get into contracts and then work in these cash crop plantations in overseas colonies. So we do see kind of the movement of indentured servants around, especially going from colonies to colonies. People from China being used as workers in Southeast Asia, for example. The other example that's sometimes thrown around by the AP is Hindus, so people from India being used in British colonies in the Caribbean and in South Africa. Gandhi actually lived for a time period in South Africa. But of course, how do we overcome the environment? Transportation innovations. They're very much like how Europeans used things like the compass during the age of exploration. So steamships, railroads, these things will help overcome environmental obstacles. All right, so some kind of continuities right here. Food production is going up, and that leads to increased population. But we do see kind of some more extreme devastation to the environment. That's kind of what makes the Industrial Revolution unique in this, in our class, basically. All right, any questions? Yes.
What were the main components of the first industrial revolution?
Textiles. Textiles.
And then of the second.
Chemicals, steel, and electricity. All right, any other questions? Yeah.
I know it's been an early time period, but we just have some people wonder how things like for thousands of discussions. Why do we really care about that?
So kind of the medieval warm period is a precursor in a way to the agricultural revolution. Innovations start happening in the Middle Ages that will be expanded upon and improved upon by the time of the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. Yes.
Did crude oil increases demand during this decade?
Yes, but it's going to be more associated with the 20th century. So if you get a question that's like petroleum is associated with which time period, it's going to be after in the 20th century, I should say. All right. All right, what about culture? Well, this cultural development, the main one that the AP would want you to know about is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a very important intellectual movement that's going to happen all around the world, but it's mostly going to start in Western Europe, in places like France and Great Britain. And the Enlightenment stresses all of these things right here. On the AP, you're bound to get at least one multiple choice set of multiple choice questions. And typically it will be a passage about someone who's inspired by the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment, what does it stress? It stresses things like natural rights, life, liberty, property, those kind of things. Those are natural rights every human being is granted or should be granted. But also there's this idea of the social contract, that government has to respect the rights of the people. So this concept of natural rights, that is oftentimes the language of the Enlightenment. It's going to be a major continuity going forward in world history. The Enlightenment influences not just revolutions, as I'll talk about more, but it's going to influence even modern day stuff. The UN Declaration of Human Rights is an example of an Enlightenment-inspired document from our current age. You don't really need to know specific philosophers. There's not going to be that much on the AP, but maybe for an LEQ sort of question, John Locke is a big name. He's the guy that coins the phrase life, liberty, property. He's especially influential in the American Revolution. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is going to pioneer this concept of the social contract. He writes a book called The Social Contract. And it's basically having that basic idea. Governments, their responsibility is to protect the rights of its citizens. So, language about natural rights, that's bound to be something you would see if there was an Enlightenment question. But also the Enlightenment is largely defined by secularism. Secularism is the opposite of being into religion. It is a non-religious idea. So the Enlightenment stresses kind of a more scientific, more rational analyzing of social relations. It's a huge departure, a huge change from absolutism. Absolutism stressed the idea of divine right. God commanded me as a king to rule over you people. However, the Enlightenment is throwing into question the existence of God in some cases. It is a secular understanding of the international community. It's going to question religion's dominance over government. But also generally the Enlightenment questions existing social orders. That's the basic theme the AP would want you to know about. So that's going to have a lot of political impacts and social impacts as well. This idea of questioning the status quo, the things, how it's always been, that's a big part about the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is going to influence various revolutions. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Latin American Wars for Independence. All of those can be attributed to the age of revolutions inspired by the Enlightenment. You wouldn't get specific questions about individual revolutions, but it'd be more about general themes. Thank you. Have a good weekend. All right. So you won't get as specific questions, I should say, about the American Revolution, for example. So don't worry about that. You might get questions, though, about the Latin American independence movements. That is more relevant, at least according to the AP world. So these kind of revolutions, they tend to be led by middle-class people, by members of the bourgeoisie. They tend to be led by white people, native-born white people, so Creoles in the case of the Latin American independence wars. And generally, these political revolutions, while they do challenge absolutism, while they're influenced by things like constitutionalism, they really don't change that much in terms of social systems. So we do kind of see generally, even though these age of revolutions will happen, even though the French, American, Latin American independence revolutions will happen, generally afterwards, civil rights tends to be limited to a select few group of people, mostly white property owning men. However, kind of in response to the fact that the revolutions were intended for white middle-class men, we do see different movements to challenge the status quo, challenge gender hierarchies. We have this concept of first-wave feminism. A kind of name that oftentimes pops up as a primary source is Olympe de Gouges. Olympe de Gouges was a French feminist, and she believed the Enlightenment should apply to women as well. Women deserve the same natural rights as men. Very similarly, this language of abolitionism, of hostility to slavery, is also going to help explain the decline of slavery. Generally, abolitionism, the hostility to slavery, is going to be inspired by the Enlightenment. So if you ever get like a constitution, a primary source of the Constitution, a primary source that discusses a constitution, and it talks about civil rights, kind of all of these things could be used and put as a could be a possible answer, is what I was trying to say. All right, and we're gonna look at some other things in just a second, but the Enlightenment kind of, if you got some questions about it, tends to stress things about natural rights, secularism, and generally challenging social hierarchies. Yeah.
Was she the one who wrote the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen,
But make it women. Yeah, she wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. Yeah. All right. Any other questions about the Enlightenment? Yes.
Deism also a big part of the Enlightenment, or was it more?
No, deism is a part of this. Kind of deism is this idea that God is a rational human being. God is like a watchmaker. That's a question on your very first APUSH test next year. Just saying that out loud. But deism is that idea of kind of a rational God. It is very much related to the Enlightenment. Yeah. Right, any other questions? All right. So other things. Kind of with this rise of secularism, we do see that religion is no longer a social combining force around the world. Remember, in the age of absolute monarchs, religion was one way to stress social cohesion, one way to stress social conformity. But as religion is coming into question, thanks to the Enlightenment, we do see we need another way to unify a diverse group of people. We need nationalism. And nationalism is going to be a big trend after 1750. On the most recent quiz in this class, a lot of people kind of mixed up when nationalism came around. Nationalism is after 1750. So nationalism, this idea that we should make a nation, a country, based on a shared identity, a shared ethnic or racial identity. So nationalism is going to help lead to the unification of diverse states like Germany and Italy. But we also do see that countries like the Ottoman Empire try to encourage unity by creating their own version of nationalism. So Ottoman nationalism is Ottomanism, actually. So this idea of we need to unify the Ottoman Empire with a common national identity. But nationalism is also an important concept because it's not only going to lead to the creation of new states, but it's also going to help explain different movements against imperialism. If the question, there's sometimes on the AP and on your final actually, there are oftentimes passages from people from Africa or Asia, and they're going to talk about this need for independence. And more often than not, one of the answers is going to be nationalism. So nationalism is going to help explain a lot of different anti-colonial movements across this time period. The US is one of the first independence movements. Haiti is probably one of the other revolutions you would need to know, and then Latin America. But also in places in Africa and Asia, we do see nationalist independence movements emerge. In New Zealand, we have the Maori. They're the natives of New Zealand. They believe they should have their own country, free of the British. The Zulu in South Africa, and then the Sepoy Rebellion in India, also a nationalist demonstration. In terms of other cultural developments, we also see that in these empires, that we'll talk about more in a second, that Western countries tend to promote this idea of Westernization, of spreading Western culture, Western customs into the places they've colonized. So Westernization is going to kind of be this idea of spreading Western culture, including the Enlightenment, including nationalism. So Westernization is generally going to be kind of one of the big globalizing trends of this time period. You can compare Westernization during this age, 1750 to 1900, to this idea of a globalized culture after World War II. That's a perfectly good historical complexity. So we see a lot of different attempts by Westernized countries to Westernize the people they've conquered. In the United States, we have so-called Indian schools. These are designed to basically assimilate Native Americans into white society. In France, or I should say in French colonies, we have the spread of French as a language. That's true in Vietnam, that's true in West Africa. But kind of an unintentional consequence of spreading Western education is the spread of the Enlightenment. So this promotion of Western education has the unintended impact of spreading the Enlightenment and European ideas of nationalism. But also kind of another thing about culture is going to be reasons for imperialism. One of the big economic reasons for imperialism is natural resources. But culturally, the justification tends to be this concept right here of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, the idea that there are strong and weak nations. It is the right of a strong nation to conquer and civilize, quote unquote, a weak nation. So if there is a question about motives for imperialism, pay attention to the passage. If it's talking about strong versus weak people, the answer is social Darwinism. If it's talking about rubber, cotton, palm oil, obviously it's more economic, the source in question. But these are other kind of reasons for imperialism. This idea of bringing civilization, the idea of proving that your nation is the greatest, and to use an American example, manifest destiny. God gave this land to us to conquer. All right. So before we continue, what questions might you have about nationalism, Westernization, or about these cultural reasons right here? All right. Yes, sorry.
You said the HII revolution.
Haiti?
Sure. It's important.
I can. The basic thing you would need to know is that it is an example of slave resistance against colonialism. It's the first successful slave rebellion that leads to an independent state. And it's going to inspire kind of movements in Africa and Asia in the 20th century. That's really what you would need to know. Any other questions? All right. Government time, baby. So the Enlightenment is going to be a big political concept because it will help justify revolutions across world history. So the Enlightenment has this idea known as liberalism. Liberalism is a political idea that government should respect natural rights and should be representative of the people. There should be elections. There should be a government that protects natural rights, especially the right to property. So liberalism is going to be more in favor of having a republic. It's more in favor of a government that protects natural rights. And it is going to be a government that promotes capitalism, especially. So kind of liberalism tends to be the big political ideology of many Western countries. The United States, for example, Western Europe, and many of the Latin American societies as well. So liberalism is kind of the political implementation of these Enlightenment ideas. At the same time, we are seeing a decline of absolutism. Absolutism is basically going away because of the influence of the Enlightenment. And kind of the Enlightenment is going to inspire various revolutions. And these are kind of some of the documents that tend to pop up with regard to the Enlightenment. In Latin America, the big figure to know is Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar will lead much of these independence movements in Latin America. He writes something called the Letter from Jamaica. And basically this document is against mercantilism. Mercantilism is a restriction on private property. And if the Enlightenment stresses private property, that's a violation of natural rights. So, Letter from Jamaica against mercantilism, especially. France, the big document, is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. All men, all citizens should have the same equal rights. In the US, the two big documents are the Declaration of Independence. That's when America declares independence. Yeah. So they're kind of stressing this idea of Britain took away our natural rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And also the Constitution of the United States, the thing hanging up over there on the wall. This concept of a government based on Enlightenment principles. Protect natural rights, have a secular government. All right. Any questions kind of generally about the Enlightenment and its impact on revolutions? So basically, all of these revolutions will happen because there's this perceived notion that somebody is taking away your natural rights. The Enlightenment, all about natural rights. It's going to help justify revolutions. All right. Nationalism is also going to emerge. It is the primary way states after 1750 are going to establish cultural unity. This idea that we are all in this together. We are a shared group of people. We should have our own shared nation. Nationalism, the primary way of political organization after 1750. And that, of course, continues in the present day. So we generally do see this concept of the nation state, that your national identity is deeply associated with your ethnic identity. All right, any questions about the Enlightenment or nationalism before we look at the economy really quickly? All right, so we do kind of see a trend during the age of industrialization, during the Industrial Revolution, kind of differences in how the government is involved. In Western Europe and in the United States, there tends to be this laissez-faire approach. Anybody remember what laissez-faire describes? Laissez-faire? Yeah.
Free trade.
So yeah, it is very much related to that concept of free trade. Anybody else? Yeah.
Hands off the economy.
Hands off the economy, yes. So it is very much anti-mercantilism. Mercantilism basically goes away as a concept because of this insistence on free trade, on limited government presence in the economy. And this is actually a byproduct of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment stresses freedom for private property. There are Enlightenment philosophers like Adam Smith. He wrote The Wealth of Nations. And basically the moral of that story is government has some role to provide national security, but not to regulate the economy. That should be left up to the invisible hand, to its unseen market forces. However, we do kind of see that in response to this hands-off approach to the economy, in response to letting factory owners do whatever they want, we do see that there will be calls against laissez-faire. There will be different movements like socialism, like Karl Marx's theories of communism. And basically, kind of socialism is this call for more government regulation and intervention in the economy. Protect the rights of workers, even if that means taking away some of your economic freedoms. So kind of calls for change are in response to the unfair conditions of laissez-faire capitalism. So new political ideologies are forming. There really won't be a socialist country until after the 1900s, though. The Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution, that's when we finally see socialism adopted as a political idea. But in terms of outside of Western Europe, for the most part, the governments were not involved in helping industrialization. But outside of Europe, in Japan, China, Egypt, Russia, we do see that there is government sponsorship of industrialization. All four of those places are falling behind economically. They want to encourage competitiveness with the West by reforming their government systems, by having more government involvement in the economy. So kind of being familiar with some of these trends right here. In Japan, we have the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration, the big thing you would need to know for the AP, it's the time of industrialization in Japan. Japan is going to start industrializing largely in response to imperialism. Japan doesn't want to be taken over by the West. So in order to strengthen its economy, it's going to engage in serious political and economic reforms, government sponsorship of industrialization. The government literally backs up corporations who then are going to build factories. So we do see kind of government-sponsored corporations. That is kind of something that characterizes Japan. In Japan, there are these government-backed corporations called zaibatsu. And basically, they are huge government supported corporations that will help build factories in Japan. In Egypt, we've got Muhammad Ali. He's trying to build textile factories. However, kind of Japan, out of all of these countries, is the most successful. China is going to refuse economic reforms, largely because of its more traditionalist government, one that is influenced by a conservative neoconservatism. So very much wanting to keep things the same, not make any changes. Egypt, largely going to fall apart because of economic imperialism. The British can sell their textiles a lot cheaper, and industrialization costs a lot of money. So it makes sense if everyday Egyptians want to buy British, not Egyptian. And then Russia, incompetent monarchy, bad nobles, they don't want to reform either. All right. So in terms of the government involvement in industrialization in Western Europe, there's very limited government presence. But in places like China, Japan, Egypt, and Russia, more government presence. All right. Any questions about the economy? Catherine and then Gabby. You wouldn't need to know any of that for the AP, but kind of enlightened despots, those are absolutist monarchs that are like, we like those ideas of the Enlightenment, we just don't want to give up our political power. So we'll make some enlightened reforms, political freedom in terms of religion, for example, religious tolerance. However, kind of enlightened absolute monarchs are really going to kind of go away by the time of the French Revolution. People are demanding more republican forms of government. Yeah, Zaibatsu are basically Japanese government-backed corporations. So the government is going to be like, I'm going to make this corporation, I give it money so that it can build factories. Any other questions? Sorry.
The Meiji Restoration was successful.
It was successful. I said kind of Japan is the exception to all of this. Japan is kind of unique from all these places because its elites are willing to reform. All right. Other government things, imperialism. Imperialism is the new trend of overseas expansion. One trend that we're seeing is a transition away from these joint stock companies, things like the British East India Company, to direct government rule. So in India, for example, we saw kind of a difference between the age of colonization, with the British East India Company kind of running the economic show in India. But as time goes on, as the Sepoy Rebellion happens, we're going to see direct British control over India during the British Raj. In the Congo, we're going to see the transition away from Leopold owning it to the Belgian government itself owning it. So kind of the general trend is moving away from company rule, joint stock companies, private individuals ruling over colonies, to governments themselves, to states. But what also allows for imperialism? Mostly new technology. The repeating rifle, new technology in military affairs, boom, 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 but also medicine as well. And the medicine is especially important because before the invention of anti-malaria medicine, people couldn't get into the interior of Africa. Remember, the previous unit, the previous time period was trade post-empires. But thanks to advances in technology, we can start moving into the interior of Africa and Asia. All right. And generally, kind of European states are going to build their colonies based on these two principles here. They're either going to use warfare, they're either going to use the repeating rifle, or they're going to make diplomatic ties. They're basically going to say, we will allow you to rule over your country, but in exchange, you're going to have to allow our corporations, our businesses, to operate as they see fit. So kind of we do see the creation of what we call a secondary empire. This is basically, you could kind of think of it like a tribute state in a way. It's a state that gives its natural resources and is technically under the political control of a European country. So we do kind of see generally colonies are built these two ways, either through invasion or through signing diplomatic relations. Basically, we will give you control if you respect social hierarchies we already have, if you keep the same people in charge that were there before Europeans were. There are kind of some other things as well. We do see that there's not just this kind of takeover of different governments, but also settler colonies as well. The US is going to settle the west of its country. Russia is going to settle Siberia. Russia and the US are the most similar in terms of their overland expansion during this time. But we see other settler colonies as well. The Brits, the British, the Boers, the Dutch in South Africa, the British in New Zealand. But we also do see that Japan is also going to start carving up its own empire, taking over parts of China. And there is actually some examples of Japan sending its citizens to Korea, for example, which was a part of China at the time. So kind of Japan is going to also engage in overseas expansion, and it will send its people to live in places like the Korean Peninsula. All right. And before we look at resistance, any questions about kind of imperialism during this time? The thing you would generally need to know is that European powers are establishing control, mostly through these two ways. They're able to go to the interior of places because of the Industrial Revolution. And we do kind of generally see that the reason why Europe will become a dominant global superpower is because of new technology. That's kind of the big theme, I suppose. In terms of the rule over these colonies, there tends to be the discouragement of industry. That's one thing, but also Westernization as well. Also the establishment of social hierarchy, separating whites and natives. Any questions? All right, but in resistance to imperialism, nationalism. Lots of different examples of nationalism. We should be our own independent state. The Indian National Congress emerges in the late 1800s. That's the party Gandhi will lead in the 1940s. But we do see kind of there will be new independent states. Some of them are successful. The Zulu in South Africa. We also have Balkan and Arab independence in the Ottoman Empire as well. The Ottoman Empire is going to mostly fall apart thanks to nationalism. And there are different kind of examples of rebellions as well. The Taiping Rebellion in China, kick out the Westerners. The Sepoy Rebellion, we native Indians are going to kick out the British. The Metis Revolt in Sudan, this is an Islamic, a religious-inspired revolt there. The Opium War is also considered an example of native resistance to economic imperialism. We don't want to buy British opium. And in reaction to that, we do see conflict between the British and the Chinese. We also see the Hoxha cattle killing movement. This is basically going to be an act of resistance in which we do see native South Africans kill their own cows in a way to spiritually resist the British in that part of the world. All right, any questions? Nationalism, independence. Economic systems. All right, industrialization is the biggest kind of concept in regards to this particular time period. We've already looked at environmental reasons, natural resources, waterways, the second agricultural revolution. Economically, though, why do we see industrialization start to occur? Well, for one thing, in Western countries, we do see that there will be this idea of protecting private property, letting private companies do what they want. And that, in a way, does inspire a lot of innovation. We do see innovations, new technologies, we'll talk about more later. So kind of the government protecting these private property rights, that's going to encourage industrialization. But also Europe has a lot of money thanks to these two things right here. Capital means money. The age of colonization, this time when Europe set up colonies in Latin America, that generated a lot of money for Great Britain, for example. So all of this money generated from earlier time periods is going to help bankroll the Industrial Revolution. But also we do kind of see the precursor to the Industrial Revolution was the Commercial Revolution. And generally the Commercial Revolution is the transition of Europe's economy away from agriculture to merchant activity, to trade. So kind of this bigger emphasis on trade, that's going to be really what will lead to the rise of a middle class, the rise of a class that wants to own factories and invest in factories. Mercantilism is gone at this point. It's no longer really in existence after 1750. And instead, we do kind of see this concept of industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalism describes an economic system in which private property owners invest in centers of production, in factories. But we also do see that there are new transnational businesses emerging. These are not backed up by countries. They are privately owned corporations. So transnational businesses, these are businesses that are based in a Western country and they own land and operate their businesses in foreign places. So there are a few examples of transnational businesses. The United Fruit Company, a US corporation, it owns a lot of fruit plantations in Latin America. So it's an American-based company, but it owns land, owns natural resources in Latin America. The De Beers Company, a British company that owns land in South Africa. And then there's the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, a British-based company, but it is going to own and operate key financial institutions in Chinese cities, in Hong Kong and Shanghai. However, we do kind of see that industrialism will happen because of new manufacturing practices. We have this concept of replaceable parts. So it's the idea that you can kind of easily mass produce anything, since it's so easy to replicate the individual parts going into the final product. So kind of to use a more modern example, cars. This system in which there is a easily replicated manufacturing process allows things to be produced a lot more quickly. And when things are produced more quickly, prices go down. This is a time period in which consumer goods are really cheap. Manufacturing improvements allow for better and less expensive products. And the effect of all of this is going to be dropping European manufacturing prices way down. That's really what gives Europe the competitive edge in world history. They're able to produce things quickly. They make their goods really cheaply. They're able to sell it all over the world. It's easier to buy something that's cheap than expensive. Self-explanatory. So we do kind of see that European countries have the competitive edge because they have improvements to manufacturing. Their goods are worth less. They are more highly demanded. So in terms of kind of good things about the Industrial Revolution, goods are cheaper. Manufactured goods are cheaper. There's also jobs for people, employment opportunities. But of course, as you all experienced when we did the working simulation thing, it's bad working conditions. This idea of laissez-faire, of no government presence in the workplace, does kind of have a negative impact. It allows for abuses to workers. And obviously, this is going to be a continuity in the 21st century as well. In sweatshops, for example, in those factories relocated to places like China and India. All right. So, any questions before we continue about these economic causes or about this transition right here? All good? Okay. All right, labor, what's going on there? Slavery is gone. Slavery, I mean, technically it's still around, but for the most part, slavery is kind of absent from these industrialized countries. Slavery is largely going to go away, and we do kind of see, instead, we do see this transition to wage work. So after 1750, wage work is more of a dominant economic labor system. People are getting paid, even though they're not getting paid very well. However, we do kind of see that immigration also is changing as well. The main reason why people moved was because of slavery. It was forced movement of people. But after the abolition of slavery, we do see that the movement of people is not as coerced. There is more freedom, more independence in the movement of people around the world. And the absolute main reason why people immigrate is economic reasons, at least in terms of what the AP wants you to know. Politically, sure, escape political persecution, but the main reason is going to be job opportunities. So we do kind of see different ethnic groups are going to move around. A very easy example, if you ever got an LEQ or SAQ, is talking about immigrants going to America, going to the United States. The Irish and the Chinese, these are groups of people fleeing poverty, and they're going to work in industrialized countries, namely countries like the United States. The Chinese helped build American railroads. The Irish, they are in a lot of the early factories in the United States. However, even though most immigrants are free, we do see some exceptions to this. We do see some continuity in terms of coerced labor. People in the colonies tend to kind of be indentured servants. This movement of people overseas between colonies, that tends to be indentured servant contracts. So Indians, for example, moving to African colonies, they're mostly indentured servants. They're in some sort of contract where they're not paid and have to work for free. So Indians are going to move to places like Africa, to South Africa, to North America as well, to the Caribbean, but also Chinese workers as well, going to India, going to other parts of Southeast Asia. We also do see prisoner labor as well. Prisoner or convict labor used in places like Siberia. Russia is going to use convict labor. We also do see convicts being sent to Australia as well. So there's an example right there of the forced movement of people. British prisoners didn't have a choice really in going to Australia. Which would you rather do? Be in a British prison or be in Australia? Yeah.
I mean, obviously this going to.
Well, do you want to go to a place that everything will kill you, or do you want to stay in the worst country in the world? It was a joke, okay. In terms of manufacturing, the kind of big picture thing is that manufacturing is no longer dominant in China and India. Both of these places are seeing a decline of manufacturing thanks to imperialism. Economic imperialism is reducing China's economic independence. The Opium Wars are basically forcing China to accept manufactured goods, to remove any restrictions on trade. But we also do see kind of that's the main reason why the West has competitive edge in the world is because of industrialization. They make their goods cheaper. It's more incentive for non-industrialized places to buy European goods.
They're not very quality.
They're not better quality, no. And kind of that, there sometimes are multiple choice questions that are saying, oh, people want to trade high priced, high quality goods. No, it's low price, low quality goods.
Stuff at Dollar Tree.
Yeah, stuff at Dollar Tree, but like Penny Tree. All right, any questions? All right. Economic imperialism, everyone's favorite, yay. So, some places are directly controlled by European powers. India, for example, many countries in Africa. However, we do kind of see this concept of economic imperialism. And economic imperialism is more of an informal type of imperialism. Last year, the DBQ was actually about imperialism, about economic imperialism. So you're probably not going to get that this year. But generally, it is the concept of a foreign country, a Western country, having significant economic control over an under-industrialized society, mostly in Asia, China being the best example, and Latin America. Because China is technically independent. It's not a colony. However, we do see places like China and China and Latin America. These are places where Western countries will have a significant presence in the economy. The United Fruit Company, for example, an American transnational business, owns like 50% of the land in Guatemala. So we do see that there is this informal influence over the economies of Latin America and China. But we do kind of see that there will be wars to enforce economic imperialism. Let's break open formerly protectionist states that try to restrict foreign business. Remember, China restricted foreign business. It had the Canton system. It tried to restrict the opium trade going into China. But guess what? What do the British do? They basically walk up to China and say, buy my opium or I'll kill you. So we do see the opium wars are going to break open China to be a place to sell manufactured goods and opium. But also Japan. Japan was a protectionist, isolationist society. What did the United States do? They wanted to trade in Japan. So they sent everyone's favorite Friends actor, Matthew Perry, to have this idea of gunboat diplomacy, of trying to threaten to invade Japan if Japan didn't open up to trade from places like the United States. And generally, kind of in terms of economic system, colonial governments tended to actively discourage industrialization. They tore down factories in places like India, for example. And we do kind of see that instead of Indians owning these factories, instead of Indians owning cotton plantations, we do see that these tend to be owned by those European transnational businesses. Cotton tended to be owned by British producers. They wanted that cotton for themselves to build all these textile factories. And of course, in the Congo, we saw the very brutal example of Leopold II. He was getting really rich off of harvesting the rubber and selling it for his own personal profits. So generally, kind of, when I say governments discouraged industrialization, these colonial governments tended to give preferential treatment to European or American businesses. All right. So any questions about economic imperialism? The best example is China and Latin America. China is technically independent, but it's going to be forced to open up to free trade thanks to things like the Opium Wars. All right. Social interaction, middle class. Before, the aristocracy was the dominant class. Guess what? The Enlightenment challenged that existence. Now we're starting to see more government involvement of the middle class, of merchants, of bankers, of private property owners. So your status in society is no longer based on who you're born to, but how much money you have. So wealth is now the determinant factor in social status. So merchants, factory owners, and bankers, they're now the top of Western society. That's a huge change from the Middle Ages, when merchants were kind of at the bottom of society. Merchants were mistrusted. They started to grow in influence thanks to overseas expansion during the age of colonization. And now at the Industrial Revolution, they're the top dogs in Europe. So all of this Enlightenment revolutions generally lead to more middle-class participation in government. So the Industrial Revolution is also significant in terms of its role in class divisions. Because factories being built, that is going to lead to new social classes, the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, and the proletariat, the factory workers. So the Industrial Revolution comes with high wealth inequality across the world. We do see that the Industrial Revolution leads to massive amounts of poverty, terrible working conditions, terrible pay, and that's going to lead to pollution, that leads to disease. London, for example, is going to have an outbreak of cholera in the early Industrial Revolution, which is disease spread mostly from living in bad areas, in bad working conditions. However, in response to these high class divisions, we do see movements for change. How do we organize workers to demand social reforms? So we make labor unions. We start to appeal to this idea of socialism, of maybe having a political movement to have the government take ownership of private property. So kind of Karl Marx is going to be a big critic of this high wealth inequality. However, really, we don't see any successful socialist revolution until after the 1900s with the Russian Revolution. So the Russian Revolution is a big break in world history, as we'll talk about more later. All right. Women, what's up with women? I don't know. Well, women are going to kind of have different experiences during the Industrial Revolution. Working class women work. Do they want to? Not necessarily. Do they need to? Yes. Very low wages, not enough money for a man to single-handedly bring all the bacon home. So working class women will work oftentimes side by side with men. Children are working in factories, as we all know. However, we do see at the same time, as the middle class develops more and more money, it develops new cultural ideas as well. Maybe women don't have to work. Maybe it's better in terms of our gendered hierarchy for women not to work. So among middle class women in the age of the Industrial Revolution, we do kind of see this promotion of the cult of domesticity, that women should be housewives, they should be mothers, they should not be in the factories, they should be basically the property of men. And we do kind of see culturally as well, there are restrictive practices for women, women being viewed as housewives, but also wearing very restrictive clothing like the corset. The only reason why I bring up the corset, I saw an AP practice question. What's similar about the status of women in Western Europe and China? They had restrictive clothing. Foot binding in China, the corset in Western Europe. Yeah, only reason I bring it. So any questions about kind of these social interactions? The middle class, more dominant in society. We see high class divisions. And we do kind of see that there is a difference in the status of women. Poor women have to work. Rich women are going to be subject to that stereotype of being mothers, of being wives. And obviously it's a reaction to that image that we will see future women's movement for suffrage, especially. So kind of the idea that women are second-class citizens, that's going to inspire things like first wave feminism, demanding the right to vote. All right, any questions? All right, immigration. Why do immigrants leave? Well, for one thing, they're mostly men. They're mostly men, they're mostly single people, not entire families. And why are they leaving? Economic reasons. They want jobs. This is a time when wage work is the dominant way to make a living. You have to work 9 to 5. What a way, I messed it up, anyway. So most immigrants are going to leave for economic reasons. They are mostly men, and they're mostly going to work in factories. But we do see that among colonial immigrants, they tend to be indentured servants. They're working in cash crop production in Africa, or in the case of Indonesia, they're working in something called the cultivation system. Basically, this is a system in which the Dutch in Indonesia, they took a part of cash crops produced on plantations and sold it directly back to the Netherlands. But the result of immigration, the big kind of thing the AP would want you to know is as people are moving around the world, guess what they're doing? They're doing diffusion. They're diffusing their culture all over the place. And we do kind of see that ethnic enclaves start to pop up. These are regions in urban centers, especially, in which people are going to tend to stick with their own ethnicity. Chinatown, for example, and Chinatown exists in many societies around the world. It's not just a San Francisco, New York sort of thing. But there are ethnic enclaves for Italians and Irish people, all those people. But in reaction to this increased immigration, we do see this trend of nativism. And I spelled that wrong. It should be N-A-T-I. I spelled it wrong. Nativism. Nativism. No, nativism. Nativism is hostility to immigrants, basically. That's what it is. Kind of the two most popular examples of nativism the AP wants you to know about is the Chinese Exclusion Act and the White Australia policy. Basically excluding Chinese immigrants, the White Australia policy excluding anyone who's not white. And there's a helpful acronym right there. So in terms of kind of other racial hierarchies, well, in the colonies themselves, we do see this encouragement of ethnic and racial hierarchies. How do you justify Europeans being in your country? Well, you give Europeans the top positions in your colonial society. But we also do see that Europeans will also encourage already existing hierarchies. They're going to give preferential treatment to classes they think are ethnically superior or some cultural reason why they're superior. So in Rwanda, the good example is the Hutu and the Tutsi. The Tutsi were a small minority, but the Belgians thought they were ethnically superior for some reason. So they put them kind of on top of colonial Rwandan society, and that led to a lot of resentment to the most of the people living in Rwanda, the Hutu. And the reason why I bring up these two groups, of course, is that this is going to help explain post-colonial ethnic tensions, the Rwandan genocide being a good example of that. But another social hierarchy being enforced during the age of imperialism, Hindus versus Muslims. We tend to see the British give preferential treatment to upper caste Hindus. And that's going to lead to a lot of resentment of Muslims and lower caste people. In terms of our land-based empires, they are starting to go away. However, even though these empires need a lot of changes, need a lot of reforms, guess what? Their nobility don't want those changes. That's the general thing. They are resistant to Westernization. And we do see that nobility in China, in the Ottoman Empire, in Russia, all three of these places are really resistant to change. They don't want to fix things. They want things to stay the same way they always have been. In China, the kind of big motivation was Neo-Confucianism. There's a major continuity. It's resistant to change. And we do see that nobility, well, they are very violent sometimes. The Janissaries, for example, they literally kill Ottoman sultans when Ottoman sultans want to do change. So generally kind of in the period between 1750 and 1900, land-based empires are starting to decline. They need fixes, they need reforms, but nobles in these countries tend to be resistant to that. They are opposed to reform, and that ultimately will lead to their decline. All right. So any questions about immigration, ethnic or racial hierarchies, or about this idea of resistance to change? All right. One more, the easiest one, technology. You are more likely than not going to get an an SAQ sort of about this theme right here. Technology. What is some of the big inventions you would need to know? Well, as I said before, first industrial revolution, the biggest thing is textiles. Any technology used to improve textile production. Textiles are like clothes and stuff. In case you didn't know. But all these new technologies will help in the production of textiles. So you should be familiar with kind of technologies that are unique to both of these revolutions. First industrial revolution is the steam engine. The steam engine is probably the biggest, most important one, because it's going to move where factories can be done. We are going to see this movement away from rivers, away from windmills, away from animal-powered technology to the steam engine. It's powered with coal, it's powered with wood. It's able to produce energy by burning something. The spinning jenny makes textiles. Replaceable parts. Essentially, this is going to allow for mass production. We can produce the same thing over and over again because we use the same exact parts in every single product. Second industrial revolution, the big focuses are steel, chemicals, electricity. These are new innovations, the Bessemer steel process that makes steel easier. That's what it is. And the assembly line more so by the 1900s. Basically, kind of this idea of each individual part of a machine being added by a separate worker. So to use a car as an example, one group of workers, they'll put on the wheel, another group of workers, they're going to paint the car, and then it moves on and on until there's a final product at the end of all of this. But the second industrial revolution also important because of new military technology. The Gatling gun, it's a gun that go brr very fast. It's an early machine gun, basically. So the Gatling gun is going to allow for easier military dominance of European powers over African and Asian societies. And then all of these things will help lead to the First World War as well. Then think about next unit. Energy. How is energy going? Well, initially, ignore that. Initially, it's wood, animals, wind, and humans. And now it's coal. Coal is the big thing of the first industrial revolution. And this is going to lead to the invention of things like the steam engine, internal combustion. That's basically how a car operates. Faster production means cheaper stuff, means higher demand. Transportation, railroads, steamships. But also there's new forms of communication. Did globalization happen before the 20th century? You could make the counter argument it did, thanks to the telegraph, thanks to the telephone. All right. So you should know at least kind of the technologies associated with the first and second industrial revolution. Not much on your final about technology, but it could be an SAQ on the AP. All right, any questions? All right. So probably not going to get a DBQ about this on the AP, but multiple choice questions more so would be expected. All right. Well, I hope you have a great weekend. If I'm going to see you, I'll see you on Saturday. On Saturday.
Happy birthday.